everyone for joining us here. And welcome to Stampede, Gold Fever and Disaster in the Klondike. My name is Bethany Groff-Dureau, and I'm the Executive Director of the Museum of Old Newbury, and it's my pleasure to be part of the volunteer team of the Newburyport Literary Festival. This is our 17th year of bringing together authors and readers, and it's our biggest year ever with over 100 panelists. Now it is my great honor to introduce Brian Kastner. Hello, Brian.
Hi,
Brian,
it's good to be here.
Brian is a nonfiction writer, former explosive ordnance disposal officer. I want to have a whole other session about that. And veteran of the Iraq War. His most recent book is Stampede, A New History of the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush. He's also the best-selling author of Disappointment River, All the Ways We Kill and Die, and the war memoir, The Long Walk, which was adapted into an opera and named a New York Times editor's pick and Amazon Best Book of the Year. His journalism and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Esquire, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and on National Public Radio. He's co-editor of The Road Ahead, a collection of short stories featuring veteran writers, and has twice received grants from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting to cover the Ebola outbreak in Liberia in 2014 and to paddle the 1,200-mile Mackenzie River to the Arctic Ocean in 2016. I can't wait to hear more about that someday.
Yes, we've got our first question, I think.
We totally do. So many questions. I have so many questions. In March 2018, he joined Amnesty International as a senior crisis advisor. Brian, thank you again so much for coming to the Literary Festival, and you're on.
My sincere pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone for joining on your Sunday morning and having coffee with me, or however wherever you happen to be. Like we said, we're going to be talking about Stampede, which is my new book on the Klondike Gold Rush. And what I wanted to do on this presentation is go through photos and kind of tell the story through the photos. A benefit that I had in doing the research for this book on the 1897 Gold Rush is just an incredible wealth of archival footage. And these photos in a number of archives, particularly at the University of Washington. And so I think what a lot of people know or think they know about the Klondike, they know from these photos. So this, for example, is the Chilkoot Pass in the winter of 1898. You can see a guy there at the bottom is like, I'm not sure if that's a boat or a bookcase. And considering what people brought on this trip to the Yukon, it honestly could be either. An incredible number of things got dragged over the pass, including a croquet set, and a guy tried to bring a whole herd of oxen as well. So part of the research that I did for this book is I hiked the Chilkoot myself. You'll notice that was summer. That was July, I believe, rather than the winter. I did a little bit smarter, but it's incredible. If you're curious, you're able to still do large portions of this trip yourself. The Chilkoot Pass is a national park, half in the United States, half in Canada. It's essentially an open air museum. When you hike up the pass, things are just discarded and left in place. There's boot soles and the top of a cooking range and the boiler in Canyon City that powered the city. Like there's still all of these artifacts all over. It's an incredible place. And so I recommend, if you're curious, you can do the walk yourself. It's maybe the best 5 days of backpacking that I've ever done. So the place I'm going to start the story of the Klondike Gold Rush is with Robert Henderson. Henderson was from Nova Scotia. He was what people called like a born prospector. He had the drive and the willingness to suffer misery and hardship, and quite honestly, the greed to spend years and years panning for gold in the small creeks off the Yukon River, with the idea that someday he would strike it rich. And he was, there's kind of a controversy at the heart of the Klondike Gold Rush is who found the original gold. So I won't give away the ending of the book, but a few of the contenders are Robert Henderson, who he was on a creek that he called Gold Bottom and was eventually called Hunker Creek. It wasn't even named for him. But he made one of the initial finds. When he was panning for gold, to give you a sense of it, you would dig up gravel and swish it around in the pan and try to separate out the pay dirt and the little flecks of gold. And then a bad pan, or a normal pan, I should say, was 2 cents of gold. And when the find that he actually started digging out because he thought it would be a real working claim had 8 or 10 cents of gold, is how much gold was just in one of those pans that he thought worth working on. By the end of the gold rush, people working in some of the mines were pulling out pans that had $250 and $400 worth of gold each, is what they ended up finding by the end of it. Another contender for who discovered the gold is George Washington Carmack. He's there on the right. He's here with his wife, Kate, and his daughter, Gracie Grace. Kate is Tagish. She's indigenous. Her Tagish name is Shaw Claw, but George couldn't pronounce her name, and so he renamed her Kate. As a married man myself, I cannot imagine renaming my wife, but such was some of the unfortunate relations between whites and indigenous people at the time. And George Washington Carmack was American. He was a Marine that had gone AWOL, and he was known as a man who was not willing to do white man's work, as they called it. He was not a prospector. He was very opposite Henderson in that way. He was a trapper. He fished, he hunted. He basically lived like the indigenous people there with an indigenous wife. And whether he found the gold, it's only because he stumbled upon it. And he would have stumbled upon it when he was with a man named Caish, as his Tagish name. Skookum Jim is how he's known to history as well, who was Kate's brother. So it was his brother-in-law, Skookum Jim, and George Carmack that were also up on the creeks at the same time as Henderson. This is Skookum Jim standing with what would ultimately be his claim. He did end up a wealthy man in the end, but donated much of his wealth. And the Skookum Jim Friendship Center in Whitehorse, in Yukon territory, is still today a place where it provides social services, pregnancy counseling and legal services, and a number of other of those services now. So of all the gold that was pulled out of the Klondike, very little of it stayed and very little of it benefited the communities who were already there. Skookum Jim is one notable exception. Another of the people that were up there at the time are the Berries, Clarence and Ethel Berry. Clarence is there with the pan on the sluice. Ethel is standing there in her flower dress with her arms crossed, looking fairly upset, or at least dour. They were a husband and wife mining team. And when they left in the summer of 1898, they were named the third richest couple, or the third richest miners, to come out of the Klondike. And they did it because they worked together. So most of the stampede would ultimately be men, 95% men, mostly white, very few women, very few people of other races. But the men were mostly single, and when you spend all day panning for gold, or eventually if you have a claim, digging and trying to dig out a dump, or or to do the cleanup or whatever else, to spend all day working and then not have anyone, then have to make your own food and keep your own house and do all those other things, keep track of the gold, do all that kind of stuff. It was extremely tiring. The fact that they worked together, Ethel made meals for a crew that they ultimately hired. She was the accountant for not just her claim, but a number of the other claims. They were really a team together, and so were able to be much more successful because of it. I should say the Berry family, they never had children themselves, but their nieces and nephews ended up doing extremely well. Very few people kept their money in the Klondike, but the Berries did. The Berries took their gold money, put it into petroleum. They eventually bought gas fields out down in California, in like Bakersfield, California. At one point, they owned the Los Angeles Angels baseball team. And Berry Petroleum sold in 2014 to private equity for billions of dollars. And so there's one of those. If you're looking for a all-American success story, the Berries are one of the very few. But what the basic story of what happened is that the gold was discovered by someone in 1897. There was a kind of a mini stampede of the several hundred people that were already trying to pan for gold up and down the Yukon at places like 40 Mile and Circle City. And they descended on what would ultimately be Dawson City, and staked a whole bunch of claims, worked over the winter and into the summer. And then in the next summer, they left after the spring cleanup, and they arrived in San Francisco and Seattle. And that's when the headlines came about the incredible riches that were to be found. And you had these amazing crowds in 1897 in that summer that would show up. This is, I believe, the wharf in San Francisco, where people were hounding to get on boats to go up to Alaska. Why would that be? This is maybe the number one question I get, is what made people want to go to the Klondike at that time? Why would people go to Alaska as winter was starting? Like, this doesn't make any sense. So let me give just a little bit of the history of that. One part of that history is that there was a terrible economic depression. So we don't hear much about the Panic of 1893 anymore. But at the time, it was the worst depression that the United States had yet endured. And a lot of the problems economically are things that are going to sound familiar. So the railroads were overbuilt. They were the modern communication, technological marvel of the time, a little bit like .coms in the late 90s. They were overinvested, overbuilt. They started to fail. When they failed, banks failed. When banks failed, then a number of the real estate economy across the country failed. People went underwater with their mortgages. They didn't have jobs they were starting to lose their jobs. They couldn't pay back the mortgages. This meant that more banks failed. And you just had this kind of wide economic depression across the country. The average wage at the time to work in a factory was about 10 cents an hour. And that equates to about $3 an hour today. And this was the end of the Gilded Age, when you had the Vanderbilts and Carnegies and Rockefellers and such. You had extreme wealth, and then you had extreme poverty at the bottom end. And adding to this economic problem, there was a specific problem around gold. And that specific problem was that there were gold-backed dollars and silver-backed dollars. So not to go into monetary policy, which will put everybody to sleep, even with your coffee. But the basic idea is that a gold-backed dollar was worth more than a silver-backed dollar. And because of that, the rich kept the gold-backed dollars, silver-backed dollars for everybody else. This is when you had William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold speech, and this idea, should the US move off of gold-backed currency? And so at the same time that you have this political discussion about gold, and you have a wide economic problem, and people are out of work, suddenly you get these headlines that summer that there was gold in the Klondike. And it's like the solution to everybody's problems was just written on the headline newspapers all over the country. And so you got this incredible wave, this incredible stampede. And they went in a couple different ways. You can see this map here. So the main route, which is one of the dotted lines, they would leave Seattle or leave Victoria, British Columbia, and sail that inside passage up Southeast Alaska, past Juneau, and they would disembark at one of two ports, either Dyea or Skagway, which are both very close to each other. Skagway is still a cruise ship port. If you've ever taken an Alaskan cruise, there's a decent chance you stopped in Skagway. And that's where you would unload, carry your stuff up over the pass, get into the headwaters of the Yukon River, and then float down to Dawson, which is kind of on the top of your screen. There were some other routes, though. The main other route, or one of the main other routes, was to take an ocean liner all the way around the Aleutian Islands, up into the Bering Sea, and then up the Yukon River all the way to Dawson. And this was where people that had a little bit more money tried this. And ultimately, most of them got caught. The Yukon River is shallow, freezes in the winter, of course. And those paddle boats, got stuck along the Yukon River, and they ended up having to winter over. There were also a number of people that tried to walk from Edmonton and from other places in interior rural Canada. Thousands of people tried to walk the entire way, or they tried to go part of the way, say up the Skookum River in British Columbia, and then walk the rest of the way. There's one place marked, it might be hard to see, Telegraph Creek, that's north of Wrangell. People tried to go up that river and then go up this old telegraph line that wasn't really there. And really, the important thing here is, in the end, because 100,000 people tried to leave into Alaska and the Yukon in the teeth of winter, you ended up having a man-made natural disaster that stretched all the way from Seattle to far western Alaska and then to Dawson, where you had tens of thousands of people caught in various places on steamboats, on the river boats, in the passes, in just rural Canada, and then were stuck over the winter. When people got to Skagway or Dyea, the two ports, they would have unloaded their 1,000 pounds of gear, which consisted of everything from flour to pickaxes to pans to tents to everything else. And they would, I think a couple things worth noting about this. One is, these were not hardened frontiers people. It's not like people were leaving their homesteads in Nebraska and they were used to hardship, used to working outside, and then they decided to go to Alaska. It was largely urban people from Boston, from New York, from Toronto, from Philadelphia, and they would, they were modern city people. They rode streetcars. Most had electricity. There's plumbing. They live in tenement buildings. They had access to all of these modern amenities, and they didn't know how to hitch a horse. They didn't know how to pan for gold. They didn't know how to mine. A lot of them showed up on the boat in Seattle in their suits and patent leather shoes, and then only changed into the clothes that you see there, it kind of as a costume as they were going over. And the 100,000 people that went, this was a large percentage of the country. Or at least, like for comparison's sake, I'll say 100,000 is the combined populations of Seattle and Los Angeles at the time. So really just an incredible wave of people. Some of them went over the Chilkoot Pass, which I've already mentioned, which leaves from Dyea. Some of them tried to go up the White Pass from Skagway, and that is now a railroad. But at the time, it was a barely improved track. There was this idea that it would be an easier pass because they had heard it was going to turn into a railroad. But when in reality, it was basically slick rock on the side of a mountain. And so this trail ended up being known as the Dead Horse Trail because they didn't know how to hitch horses, how to use horses, how to do any of that kind of thing. The horses were extremely abused. Horses were useless by the time they got to the top of the pass. They were just killed summarily at the top. Some were whipped to death. There's a report of a horse committing suicide that just walked off the trail and into the gorge because of how badly they were being whipped and beaten. And so it's one of the tragedies of the gold rush is not just the human suffering, but the suffering on animals, and particularly horses as well. The other option besides the White Pass, like I mentioned, is this Chilkoot Trail. And this is kind of the iconic photo, is when you get to the very, very top, there's this amphitheater and the trail up is the Golden Stairs. And you can see that line of people on the left, trying to go up that way. Eventually they put in a tramway. But when people would walk this and they had 1,000 pounds of gear, obviously you can't move 1,000 pounds at once. So it would often be 20 trips of 50 pounds each. And you would end up if you do that, it means you have to walk every bit of the trail 39 times. And so they would move their 50 pounds of goods, so far and go back and go back and go back. And it would take months to get over this trail from how they had to move their equipment. And then once you get over the pass, you still have to carry it down to Lake Bennett or Lake Lindeman. You have to build a boat. If you don't know how to hitch a horse, if you're a city person, you probably don't know how to build a boat either. And so a lot of these boats were death traps, and you had to run Miles Canyon, you had to run the Whitehorse Rapids. Very few people had boat skills. And so it was really, I think, another question I get asked is how many people died in the course of the gold rush? And the answer is we have no idea. Out of those 100,000 people that left, 30,000 ended up making it to Dawson, which means, about 60 or 70,000 didn't. Now, many of them, of course, turned around. But how many of them died? How many of them died in shipwrecks? How many of them died trying to navigate the Whitehorse Rapids? How many starved to death? How many froze to death? I mean, we simply don't know. One of the chroniclers of the gold rush, and my aspiration for this book was to write it as purely narrative as possible, to write it like you were there, to never break the fourth wall, never, interrupt the story by citing, this letter or that letter or whatever else. I put it all in the footnotes. And so what I needed was some narrators of people who had done it. One of the narrators was Tappan Adney, who I think is a fascinating character. He was writing for Harper's Magazine. He ends up being one of my main characters, and he did the Chilkoot and White Pass. He saw both parts of it, and is really one of the incredible chroniclers of the Stampede. If you're looking for another book to read from the time, his book came out in 1899, and I think is really, one of the best stories. One of the other chroniclers, of course, who would become far more famous than Tappan Adney for his stories of the Klondike Gold Rush was Jack London. And this is a photo from Sheep Camp. Sheep Camp is one of the main camps kind of on your way up the Chilkoot. And if we zoom in on this photo, the short guy with his one hand in his pockets, kind of at his belt, one in from the left, kind of a bit of a baseball cap and curly hair. That's Jack London. At the time of the gold rush, he wasn't the Jack London we know now. He was just a guy who had worked in a pickle factory. He had worked in a bobbin factory. He had worked as an oyster pirate in San Francisco Bay. He had been an able-bodied seaman on a ship to Japan, but he was just desperate to avoid factory work, and got swept up in the Stampede as many others. He wintered over on the Stewart River, which is just south of the Klondike River. He tried to pan for gold. He got about $5 total. He got terrible, terrible scurvy, where one leg didn't work and kind of retracted up into his body. He had to be essentially medically evacuated. Somebody else got him out and got him down the Yukon River. It's a bit of a cliche, but yeah, he didn't get his riches in gold. He got his riches in all the stories that were inspired by his experience. So this is Dawson City. And as, you can see, it is kind of the classic boom town. Like I said, 100,000 people went on the Stampede. About 30 or 40,000 actually made it to Dawson. And the proportion that you can see there of women to men and women and children to men is about right for who ultimately made it, to this classic boomtown that grows quickly and then, very quickly shrank as well. When people got there, not to again give away too much of the ending of the book, the people who arrived later, most of the claims were taken. Very few people got rich that arrived later. It was the people who were already in country that knew how to mine that got the first and best claims. And this is what a mine looks like up in the Klondike. So I'll just explain for a minute. This wasn't like mining in Colorado or Nevada or some of the other mines in, quote, the Old West. It was a very different sort of mining. And the reason is because the bedrock in those particular mountains and along those creeks is hidden by up to 50 feet of permafrost. And so the way to get through the soil and get through the muck and get through the frozen ground, there was no way to dig at it with a pickaxe, and there was no way to dynamite it out because that would just tighten the gravel. They had to burn their way down. They would build a fire overnight, which would kind of loosen and thaw some of the ground. And then in the morning, they would spend all day digging out what they had loosened, a shaft that went straight down. and then start that fire the next night. And this is what they did all winter. They would burn their way down, and it could take a month to get to bedrock. And then when you got to bedrock, the goal was to find the pay streak. And the pay streak would be that, not the location of the creek as it was today. The pay streak was where the creek used to be, thousands or millions of years ago. And so they would cut across the side of the mountain, make all these shafts, find the pay streak, and by far most of the gold, because it's heavier than water, it would follow the old creek and then get caught in old turns of the creek. It would follow that trail down the mountain, and they would, follow that pay streak, dig all that muck up over the winter, and then in the spring try to thaw it, and that's the spring cleanup. One way to get rich in the Klondike was to mine. By far, the better way was to mine the miners. And this man, John J. Healy, was one of the main businessmen who really got rich, essentially selling flour and selling bacon to starving men. At one point, he was a millionaire when he left Dawson City. He owned 10% of the gold that had been mined that year in the Klondike. And I should say that the justice system, the way that, there's this, how did people keep their gold, and how did they make sure that they weren't going to be robbed? The justice system was really focused on thievery. And people would be, as you can see here, whipped at sheep camp if you were a thief. There was no worse thing than being a thief, stealing somebody's food that Healy had just sold to you, stealing somebody's gold. And the person who really personified that law and order system and really implemented it in the latter half of the gold rush was Samuel Steele, can't make up that name, who was the commander of the Northwest Mounted Police at the time up in Dawson City. He was in charge of hangings. He was in charge of the law and order. One of the first groups that he hanged were the Nantucket Boys. You can see 4 of the Nantucket Boys here. They had this system of thievery, or of justice for thievery, and how it was enforced. I don't think it will surprise anyone that it was not enforced equally. The very first people to be hung legally in Dawson City were indigenous, were the Nantucket Boys. They had stolen from a miner. They were locked up in jail. 2 of them died of consumption. And then before the other 2 could die of consumption, they were hung. And in fact, at least one of them was probably underage. The boy in the middle was probably under 18 at the time that he was hung. He was at least a teenager. Some of the records are contradictory of what age he was. But this is how, this is how justice and law and order was implemented. The other main person who mined the miners was Belinda Mulrooney, who is also a fascinating character, was an Irish immigrant, had a hot dog stand at the World's Fair in Chicago, and then moved north. And she mined the miners by opening hotels and restaurants, by basically buying stampeders food from them when they arrived and then selling it back to them in the form of meals. She built the first 3-story hotel in Dawson City, the Fairview Hotel, and became extremely wealthy, married a count, lost all of her money eventually to the count, moved to Yakima, Washington, opened an apple orchard, and actually by the end of her life was helping to build ships in the docks in Seattle for World War II. Another woman who I thought was really fascinating was Anna DeGraff. She went on the Stampede not as a miner, but as a mother. She was looking for her son, who had disappeared years before, and she was sure would have gone on the Stampede. She searched for her son for years. She ended up not really being a mother to her son, but being a mother to some of the dancing girls and to what were called goodtime girls, women that worked in the sex industry. This is Klondike Kate, one of the most famous, but Anna DeGraff was a seamstress, made the costumes for the women that performed in the theaters and in the shows. But Anna DeGraff was also a mother to some of the sex workers. This title of this one is A Group of Hard Workers in Dawson. There was an entire demi-monde sex industry in in Dawson. And I think it's just worth mentioning briefly that, like I was saying, the law and order, which is so much, especially for Canadians, central to the story of the Klondike, is that it wasn't the Wild West like in the United States. It was very safe. Well, that might have been true for white men. It wasn't true for Indigenous people. It definitely wasn't true for the women in the sex industry. If you read their journals and read the newspapers of the time, the murder and abuse that took place was really quite extraordinary. So here's my last photo. And the last thing I'll talk about before taking questions. And this is Soapy Smith, which is one of those larger than life characters. He was a gangster in Skagway and really, in some ways, embodied the entire gold rush. He was a bunco man and a card sharp and a con artist throughout the West. He was kicked out of cities from Creede to Denver and other places. He went to Alaska because he envisioned it as the last West, the last frontier of America. But when he got up there, he essentially did nothing but run scams. He would scam people out of their money in various ways. He would tell them that they had the wrong gear and he needed to resell them new gear. He would run banks that weren't banks. He ran saloons. He ran gambling establishments where only the house could win, of course. My favorite is that he ran a telegraph office, which was supposed to be a telegraph where you could wire money back to the United States. But the telegraph line was fake. It went right into the ground. So he would not just charge you or not just take your money when you tried to wire money back to the United States, he would charge you a fee as well. He went out in spectacular fashion in a gunfight on the docks in Skagway that literally is stranger than fiction and you could not make up. So I'm going to end it there and stop sharing and see if I can get back to my, Zoom.
You're
there
back.
We are. Okay. The technology worked. So that's my presentation on the book. And I think we have about 10 minutes and I would love to get questions and see what people think or what they'd like to know more about.
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's amazing that anybody survived that. I mean, I had to go put extra wool socks on just from looking at those pictures. So you have quite a few questions actually in the question and answer section. The first one is from Raphael Hoffman, who says, what was your favorite character to write and or research?
Oh, yeah. So I don't know if I have a favorite. I would say that the story that I was drawn to, though, and I wrote first, was actually Anna de Graaf's, the mother, because this may be a good point to talk about some of the sources. I had access to all sorts of archives and journals and memoirs and such that a lot of historians, I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist, but when the main histories of the Klondike were written in the 1950s, and I had access to stuff that they did. And one example was Anna de Graaf's journal, which was published by her family by a small out-of-print press now in the 1970s. And I mean, she's fascinating because she actually took 3 trips to Alaska. She was in Circle City for a while, and just the people that she met and the stories that she had access to and her story of the trail, the idea of being a mother to the miners. I guess as a father, I have 4 boys. And so, having a parental view of some of this, I don't know, I was just really drawn to the things that she would do, not out of greed, but out of searching for her son. I think to me, that was really compelling. And ended up becoming a defender, literally, with a 6-shooter, became a defender of some of the women when they were attacked up in Dawson City.
So I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but did she ever find her son?
I can't answer that.
Okay. Gotta read
that might be the answer.
All right. Well, actually, speaking of diaries and other wonderful material that was not available, and we have a great question from Bev Pierce. Hi, Bev. I know Bev. She says, my great-grandfather, a city guy from Manhattan, went to the Klondike for gold. He and his partner left Seattle August 4th, 1897, and made it to Skagway on the 14th. They left Skagway on the 17th and arrived Klondike City on October 20th. He died at the infirmary in Dawson City on January 8th, 1898. There are terribly sad letters he wrote back to family in New York City, missing his 3 small children, whom he had left with his sisters. I have his handwritten diary of the whole ordeal. So you must often meet people who have family objects or memorabilia or records from that time.
Yeah, and this is an incredible story, Bev, and a sad story, of course. And but in some ways, like really, like I I hope I don't diminish it by saying like typical in some way, which is people that left right away. There was a very small group that made it to Dawson City before the Yukon froze at the end of October, so he would have been included in that. And then that first winter in Dawson City, people starved to death, people froze to death. There wasn't enough food that had gotten in. And there was a Jesuit missionary named Father Judge, who appears in my book slightly, who ran the hospital, but didn't actually provide any care, mostly just, helped people in their final moments as they were sick. So, I'm sorry for that experience from your family, but I think it really does speak to the incredible challenges and what people faced, trying to go up there.
Powerful story. All right, from Glee. Hello, Glee. Would you please discuss some of the differences between the California Gold Rush of the late 1840s and the Klondike Gold Rush?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say two main differences. In the California Gold Rush, people just really wanted to go to California. There was, and California was known for the things it's known now, and would eventually, there were these farming opportunities and homesteading, and San Francisco was growing as a port, and there was this, this idea of like expanding the country and all that kind of stuff. So people crossed the country and went to California for lots of reasons. And it's almost like the gold was a good excuse and led to all of the statehood and all of these other things. People didn't go to Alaska to homestead, right? Like it was very, very focused on the gold. It took years for the California Gold Rush to happen. The Klondike Gold Rush, from discovery to the end, and again, I don't want to give away how Dawson City kind of implodes, but that was 1,000 days. It was a very, very quick time frame that it all happened in. The other main thing is just the amount of gold that came out. I brought up that Henderson was, he got like 8 cents a pan, and he thought that was great. And that, but eventually there were $250 and $400 pans that came out of the Klondike. The largest pan that I ever found in my research in California was 40 cents a pan. So just the density of gold in the Klondike was like nothing that they saw in California.
Wow, that's the idea of it being 1,000-day experience really puts that in perspective.
It was like a fever dream almost.
Wow.
And then Dawson City, Dawson City today is 1,000 people, or 1,500 or so, but in 1910 it was 1,000 people. So it went from 40,000 to 1,000 in 12 years.
That's crazy. We have a little follow-up from Bev Pierce, who wanted to say that there were generations-long implications of the whole thing, and her great-grandfather did die at that hospital.
Oh, wow.
That's interesting personal connection.
Thank you for sharing that, Bev. Yeah.
So we have a question from Barbara, who, well, this is a comment. She says, "So well done. Love the photos that go with your great talk." And then someone asked anonymously, "Do you live in Alaska?"
I don't. I live in Buffalo, New York, which I have been told by everyone who doesn't live in Buffalo sounds like Alaska to them, with the amount of snow and such. I promise it's not. But no, I love Alaska. I have a number of friends up there. I've been up to many places in Alaska for many reasons. And so it was a real joy to be able to do this book because of, those connections and friends that I've been able to make over the years.
Wonderful. Well, we have another compliment from Marilyn, who says that she loves the photos and all the background explanations. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Marilyn.
We also, let's see, we have a question actually in the chat. It says, "I'm reading your book. What a treat. How did you get interested in this subject? And is the area still being mined for minerals?"
The area is still being mined. In fact, you can watch reality shows like Yukon Gold, where I covered just up until 1899. After that, all of these creeks got dredged. They don't look anything today like they looked at the time. And now, because of new technology, they're going through the dredges and pulling out almost like microscopic pieces of gold from some of these areas that have been gone over how many times at this point. So yeah, it is still it's still being extracted. How did I get involved in this? It's almost like I wish I could tell you like some eureka moment when I decided that I wanted to work on the Klondike. I've always been curious about the North. I think that one of the connections, though, I've had a hard time recreating this, but to go back to a previous book, which Bethany had mentioned, Disappointment River, which is about paddling down the Mackenzie River, which is kind of like the next river to the east from the Yukon. It's on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, an incredible, huge river. The canoes that they went down that river, the Mackenzie himself, he was a fur trader. When he did that trip in 1783 and in the 1780s, he was in these birch bark canoes, which are like with the like French voyageurs. So not to go down like a whole pathway here, but I was really interested in the North and this travel in these canoes. And the only reason that we know about these canoes and how they were built and like the real details of these incredible birch bark canoes is Tappan Adney, of all people, who was the Harper's correspondent who went on the Klondike Gold Rush. After that, he was from New Brunswick, or he was from the United States, but lived in New Brunswick eventually, became really interested in canoes and voyagers and the Maliseet people and all of these things. And it's really because of him that we have the history of the birch bark canoes that were, and really how those canoes were used throughout Northeast North America. I guess he's the connection. I was writing a book about canoes and I found this Tappan Adney guy and I'm like, oh, and then he wrote a book about the Klondike. And I guess that's the clearest link I have for the ideas of the two.
Well, I mean, you can put this in the category of things that sort of you can't really believe happened quite the way they happened. It's just
right.
An extraordinary story. I am provincial enough that I am most interested in things that have some connection to my wonderful small city in Newburyport here. And I was astonished how many Newburyporters packed up their jewelry stores or whatever and went off to the Klondike. Do you find a lot of, you talked about people leaving from San Francisco and various places on the West Coast, but what would a journey have looked like for someone that was in New England?
Yeah, we can track, like Tappan Adney did that. He was in New York City at the time. He had shot a moose in Maine, which is the moose in the New York City Natural History Museum still today. And for people like that, they would bought a train ticket. And I should say, like real quickly, like who's the kind of person that went on it? Lots of Northeast people. You needed to have a little money. Actually, like the jewelry store owner is the kind of person that might have done that. If you were truly poor, you didn't have the money to buy 1,000 pounds of good and the flour and buy the train ticket and everything else, right? So it was kind of like working class, middle class people who went. You would get on a train. You would go from Boston or from New York, or whatever. You would cross the country to Seattle. In Seattle, there were a number of companies that would try to sell you all of these goods that you need. When Tappan Adney did it, for whatever reason, he went north and crossed in Canada and found that the shops were sold out of like cold weather gear all the way to Winnipeg. Because he was trying to leave at exactly that same time. And then, yeah, you would get on the boat. You would try to maybe buy a horse in Seattle to see if because you had heard a rumor, oh, I need this. There was lots of these like rumors. What do you need? Every newspaper would have a different list. Here's the official list of what you need to go to the Klondike. And it really was countrywide. To go back, here's another kind of answer to your question, and maybe an answer to address kind of what Bev was talking about too. I tried to investigate a little bit of how many people died. And nobody knows how many people died. And one reason is they would die. A lot of people died anonymously. And the only people that paid attention were their hometown newspapers, whether it was Newburyport or wherever. So I went through at the Library of Congress. They have this local newspaper project. And I just tried to read obituaries and read headlines in like little random towns in Ohio, random towns in Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. And it'd be like, 6 local boys dead in the Klondike, and 2 of them drowned and 4 of them were missing. And we have their names there in the local newspaper. But unless I went through every local newspaper for 2 years and tried to add all that up, that's the only way a lot of the, it's the only way it was kept track of. So I'm not a real historian. I hope a real historian someday does, try to go through all of that. And
sounds like an amazing project for a group of interns.
Yes, there you go. Like, it would be extremely tedious, but it might start to answer that question of like, what was the real, and what Bev said, like generational impact too. Like, there was some of this impact was kind of swept under the rug because the gold rush ended in 1899. Some people died. We don't know how many. But once 1900 hit, you had the Spanish-American War. There was obviously at the end of the century, a year or 2 before that, but like you had the Spanish-American War in there. You had a new century. You had a new president. You had a young president. You had Teddy Roosevelt in 1901. You had the White Fleet. America was like, looking to the future. And the Alaskan Gold Rush was like this weird old Wild West history. Like it wasn't applicable. And it was like an anachronism almost immediately. One of the craziest things that I found in the research was that people started to go to Dawson City as tourists by the end of the gold rush. They weren't going up. They just wanted to go up and like see it because they had heard like all these crazy things were happening. That was already by 1900. Tourists were showing up. It was like an old fashioned thing, and Dawson became a tourist trap.
Well, I think some of the rest of us are going to head up there. Bev Pierce just noted that there is a tiny cemetery next to the infirmary in Dawson City. Right. So there you go. We'll add that to the itinerary. Well, I feel like we could talk about this all day. Just absolutely wonderful, fascinating topic. I am excited to go back and reread your book. And
thank you so much.
Look at some more of these local folks that made it up there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all in the audience for coming out here on this beautiful in Newburyport Sunday morning. Brian, it has been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to having you back again so I can ask the rest of my questions.
I would love that. Thank you. Cheers.
Sounds wonderful. So thank you again, and we'll see you again, I'm sure.
Thank you. Be well all.
Bye, everyone.